Welcome, guys, back to another episode of Truth C Squared podcast. I am one of your hosts, Colton Carlson, and my other host, kind of, Shamez Foster. So this should be episode five,
Six.
six, episode six. We took a break dealing with our beloved friend Stratton last episode, but now what we're going to do is go back to what we originally started with, and that's on the models of providence. So we described the models of providence in episode 4, the basic models of providence. Now what we're going to be doing is going through some objections. Now these objections are not going to be very detailed, as in they're not going to be whole book length objections. They're just going to be common layman objections so that you can kind of wrap your head around. Obviously, we're going to then make a case on why we think the best model of providence is determinism. That'll be at the end. So, ready to go, brother?
My mic not picked that up. I was really
No.
hoping. That'd have been hilarious right in the middle of your monologue. It's just crying. I was kind of in the middle of eating, but I'm pretty much done.
I don't really care.
I know you don't. You don't care what's going on in my life. You just gotta do the podcast right now. I'm only here to record and edit. Backdoor.
Yeah, I'm gonna start talking then.
Right. I'll be over here if you need me.
Let's start with the objections, starting with a couple of caveat distinctions. Before we get into the objections of like open theism, simple foreknowledge, and Molinism, blah, 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 I'm going to start with some distinctions. So the first one is models of providence can be both risky and non-risky. And so what that means is if you have a risky model of providence, and that means that God did not know with certainty whether or not evil would prevail in his creation. So in other words, he took the risk, so to speak, and went through his creation, went through the creation anyways, only to find out afterwards, like, oh junk, evil prevailed. Adam and Eve sinned. Now what do I have to do? I have to redeem it. Now, I'm obviously painting it with a broad brush, and many of my friends would probably think like that's awful, that's not what we think at all. But I mean, I would just respond kindly like, is it though? Because you have a God in these risky models who he doesn't know that sin is actually going to obtain. He creates it knowing that there is a risk, and yet risk happened, sin obtained, and he's like, I have to redeem this. What do I do? Genesis 3:15. I'm going to send a redeemer to crush the head of the serpent. That's what I'll do. That will show him. That's what we have in a risky providence. Now, non-risky providences are obviously going to be antithetical to risky providences. So open theism and simple foreknowledge are usually considered as risky providences. So open theism just had no idea that there would be sin, as in like he took the risk. They could be sin, I guess, possibly, but he took the risk. And then simple foreknowledge, remember, God doesn't know until after he created what the future would entail. So after he created the world, then he just simply knows the future, and then he foreknew that Adam and Eve would fall after creating the world. And obviously, because he's a loving God, he's not just going to destroy them and kill them off and start over, right? Because he loves what he creates, and so he lets it go off, and he plans for a redeemer. That's risky. The non-risky are considered Molinism and Calvinism. These are classified as non-risky providence systems. Why? Because these systems, God did know with certainty whether or not evil would prevail in his creation. He did not then take the risk when creating the world. God knew before creation that evil would prevail in the actual world. whereas in open theism, simple foreknowledge, God didn't know with certainty that evil would prevail. Okay, so that's a distinction that's worth having. Good so far, I hope.
I think so.
Reformed scholar Paul Helm originally, so as far as I know, has originally coined the term, and I think it pretty much sticks in the literature today. Most scholars use this kind of language. Relatively uncontroversial. It's also relatively uncontroversial is two models of decrees. So when we talk about the creation of the world, we talk about decrees because God decreed it, the creation, declared it to be. Let there be light, let there be Adam and Eve, let there be the world. That's a decree. And so we have to talk about the order of decrees. And that means there's usually two orders of decrees. The first one is called, big word, Infralapsarianism. Infralapsarianism.
So
The second one
dumb.
is
So long.
supralapsarianism. They come from the Latin, and so that's why. Like infra means that was gross. I did hear that.
Okay.
So infra means after, and supra means before. But let's get to it.
Lapsarianism.
Lapsarian is just means the order of decrees. Before the decree, after the decree, forth. So the doctrine, infralapsarianism, that doctrine, or order of decree, says that God foresaw and permitted the fall of man, and that after the fall, he then decreed election as a means of saving some. This is the kind of, oops, like, oh,
Gotta fix it.
I didn't see this. Yeah, I didn't see this happening, so I have to redeem it. How do I redeem it? Oh, Christ. How to redeem it through Christ. That'll do it. So it really is usually non-Calvinists who press this kind of order of decree, and usually the non-risky views try to press this order of decree as well. Sorry, the risky views. So open theism and simple foreknowledge, they usually press something like infralapsarianism. Arminians are notorious for pressing this kind of order of decree. So again, God foresaw and permitted fall of man, and that after the fall, he then decreed election as a means of saving some of the human race. So Adam and Eve sinned, and he saw that after, let's just say he created it, if you're a simple foreknowledge theist, and then he has to think, like, okay, what do I do? I have to send Christ. And that's a little bit towards the open theist as well.
There was a guy that I argued with on Facebook. It was first conversations. That was arguing for those verses in the New Testament, 111. Trying to argue was pretty much stating that since the fall happened, this has been the
Yeah.
not like trying to argue that from the Greek. And he had like a whole 6-page article about it, but still wrong because the word fall in the Septuagint is pretty similar. It's like catabole or something like that. Then the term used for foundation, catabole, or it's like a vowel is different, just one vowel. He was trying to say that they were the same thing, different, spelled different. They're just in that same since the
Mm.
beginning of happening. It's where like it's falling into that idea is similar between the two, but it's not a shout out to the fall as we understand it in the biblical sense. So there, yeah, a lot of non-Calvinists hold to that, but I mean, I wasn't even a Calvinist for a long time, and I never thought that that's how God operated. So maybe it's possible to be a supralapsarianismist, not be a Calvinist. Is it cool?
It is, yeah. So Molinists hold to supralapsarianism.
Yeah, I
Because
guess you mentioned that already.
so basically superlapsarian is just the opposite. So it's God decreed both election and reprobation, however you understand the term reprobation. He decreed that he decreed a world in which some would be elected either underneath the Molinist system through libertarian free will, and some would be not elected or therefore reprobate either through their libertarian free will or God's decree. So basically, Calvinists and Molinists can affirm superlapsarianism. So God decreed election, who would be saved and who would not be saved prior to creation, or what we would say before the foundation of the world, and then allowed the fall to happen as a means of carrying out his divine purposes. So a good way to think of this is this way, and I know a lot of my friends, if they're listening to this, they're going to be like, "That's not a good way to think of it," and I want to argue that it is because it's absolutely true. Infralapsarianism is basically God going to Plan B, and then supralapsarianism is no, this is God's plan all along, Plan A. Okay, because in superlapsarianism, God knew and had full control on what was happening at all times. Prior to the fall, he knew it would happen, and he still decreed it anyways. That's plan A. So God had that as his initial plan from the very beginning. Send Christ, and so he was not surprised when it happened. He was genuinely in control of it. Fall happened, Satan fell, Adam and Eve were tempted, Adam and Eve fell, and he sent his son in Matthew, Gospels in the New Testament, based off of that plan that he prophesied in Genesis 3:15. That was plan A. Infralapsarianism, it's technically plan B because Christ was not on the scene until after they fell. Otherwise, why would Christ need to come, right? Christ only comes when they fall, but if his plan was never to send Christ in the first place, then that means it would have been plan B instead of plan A. And so they may not like the wordage of it, my friends here, but that's what it is. And so those are the two distinctions that I think are helpful to know when we start getting into some of these objections.
Isn't there like a theory that the person that Adam and Eve interacting with in the garden was Jesus?
Like
Something like
walking
that.
with?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
I kind
I
of
think
would hold
that.
to that. Think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot we don't know about the garden. Um,
A lot we don't know, and aside from the Genesis to be taken literally debate, if we do take it literally just for the sake of argument, just assume it. And if it does say, God walked with them, I think it's safe to say that because God is incorporeal, God the Father is incorporeal. I want to take that literally. He didn't actually walk with them. Like, what is it, like an embodied spirit, just kind of like, I don't know, next to them as they're walking? Because it was very specific. It said God walks with them through the garden. So
yeah,
it's not just like in the New Testament, Paul says, "Oh, Christ walks with me," or "walk with Christ." That's more taken like spiritually. But in this sense, if we want to take it literally, it actually means like he walked with them foot by foot in the garden. The only one that could do that in the Trinity is Christ.
yeah, and I think of like John 1, that whole
Mhm.
beginning was blah blah blah,
Word was God,
so
yeah.
on. And then I thought of the story Shadrach, Shack and Abednego.
And
Can't believe
Abednego.
I remembered that. But there was another figure in the fire with them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we see kind of a physical representation of God a few different times in the Old Testament. Where that was probably.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's hard to figure because it's like what Jesus looks like now in his like resurrected body. Did he have a body and then became a baby? And it's kind of weird to think about, but there might be something there. It's just an interesting thought. It's not really a theological point, but for the sake
Yeah.
of drawing a more interesting narrative in your head, it's kind of interesting. But I know a lot of what we're gonna get into with these seems to be like a trying to figure out how powerful is God, how good. Different views are like shifting all the time. Like the open theist, like, well, God is very good, so he can't be that powerful, he can't control. Calvinists would say, well, I would say we would say is like God is very good and powerful. It's just the way that we think of what good is a
Tension
little
there.
bit different than how
Yeah.
most people would think good initially off the top of their head.
I think that the other views, as we're going to see, they're, I think personally, and this is just a personal thing, it's not like an actual argument. I think they're kind of scared of tension.
Yeah,
They think if tension's there, like, oh my gosh, there can't be tension, so got to give up the whole view. No, just because there's tension there, it doesn't mean that's no less true. Think about the Trinity, mind-boggling. Think about, I mean, you just mentioned a couple, like the incarnation of Christ, mind-boggling to think that maybe Christ was in the Old Testament, right? How does that relate with God and time? And
yeah,
so the Trinity is even worse. How can you have three persons but one being? Um, you can get into, a myriad of different heresies right away. The more you think about it, and the more you try to articulate, if you're not careful, right?
yeah,
So I think something is similar here. Maybe not with the heresy part, but something is similar here, where if you want to kind of bend on the tension, you're going to give up some great things about God, for an exchange for another thing, whether or not it is great. Yeah,
yeah,
the open theists, they think that, oh, it's great to preserve human freedom, but then you just give up their God's sovereignty, and foreknowledge of the future, the exhaustive foreknowledge of the future. So I think those are pretty great things, and we ought to preserve onto them as much as we can.
yeah. And it's a little bit of a tangent, but I was just thinking how like our concept of good, I think, is very unencompassing as it should be. I think we're designed to have a certain like, well, there's a lot that goes into it, but being, white, evangelical, American, like we have a concept of what's good and what's bad based
Yeah,
on the Bible, and some of it's based on culture, and some of it's based on experience. I was thinking that a lot of these things that we're going to talk about have become popularized in our culture because we didn't understand the way that these people were living back in the day. One of the things that, people say, like, God is good, the ultimate type of good, never do anything perceived as evil. They're like, how do you explain him, killing off all the firstborn in Egypt? Was that a good thing, a moral thing? You think off the top of your head, well, no, like, how people say, like, that's the God of the Old Testament. He's authoritarian and mean and blah blah. Not Christians saying that, but people who don't know much about the Bible will say that. Be like, how do we know that wasn't a good thing to? It wouldn't be a good thing for me to do, no, but it'd be a great thing for God to do. But like that would be the ultimate best case scenario in that situation. And
I-
mind you, we know a little bit about it, but we don't know what the situation really.
I've heard open theists get around that. Just real quick,
Go ahead.
I heard open theist. I don't agree with it, but open theists, one that doesn't really like you that much on the discussion forum. He has told me with that same thing with the firstborns, that God takes on the human justice system in its time. So back then, the human justice system was, yeah, you kill off the firstborn. So, as punishment for Pharaoh not listening, it's perfectly just for God, even underneath open theist criteria, to kill off the firstborn. I don't necessarily agree because I'm with you. Like, kill off all the, to kill off any of the firstborns,
And just to do
that's a
that,
lot.
to make a point
Like,
against the government system, like, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree, but again, you're just explaining another part of way maybe why God did that. And I would say it is a good thing that he did that. But my explanation would be it's a good thing because he's God and that's what he did. And that's what makes it good by definition. Like there's
I would
nothing
disagree
else
with
that I
you.
need, you know?
I disagree with you there, but I'm not going to get into it.
What do you mean?
um,
How can you disagree with it? It's good? Like whatever God does by
I don't,
definition
yeah, I
is
don't want,
good.
whatever God does by definition is good, but that does not mean that if he did something horrific, therefore it is good.
It's
I
good
think
for
that is,
him to do. I would say that. Again, you're talking about tension, right? Like we look at
yeah,
it like I'm not thinking, okay, it's good for me to murder the firstborn of an entire people. God did it. Why can't I do it? Like God told them to sack the cities and take all the gold and bring it to the treasury. Why shouldn't I? That's how you get into crusades, right? Is by that stupid line of thinking. But I myself would say I wasn't commanded to do that. I wasn't told to do that by God. I was told to love thy neighbor as thyself and the commandments and all that stuff. So for me to do something like that would be horrific. But for God to do something like that, it's his call and he has his
yeah, I
reasons and
think
he's infinitely more wise than me. That doesn't mean it's good for God, doesn't mean it's good for me necessarily.
I would agree with
Sometimes it's
that.
the same, but not always.
He's a peculiar character. Um, so yes, it's perfectly within God's prerogative to say, "Do not kill." Yet, if he just took a life, it would be fine. He does that, obviously, in the Old Testament. So I don't want to belabor too much on the point
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
One last example that I think is really telling is this: crucifixion itself was determined by God in Isaiah 53. And as far as I know, I'm pretty sure you would agree, Christ was innocent.
Yeah.
He was the most perfect, innocent human being.
His own
And yet,
son.
he commanded the torture and death, not just the death, not like a quick death. I mean, whole almost like what 12-hour ordeal.
Um
Um, from like when he was arrested at 9 o'clock at night until when he was like crucified
yeah,
at like
yeah.
midday. So it
Yeah.
was about 15-hour ordeal from him being beat up, put in prison, put on the trial,
Lashed
whipped, scourged, made
the
fun
walk.
of. Yeah. So, I mean,
He was like
so
3 hours on the actual cross.
so
Or
this kind of idea where God is, I don't know, culpable for something that he may have caused or um, something that he may have determined, I think is doesn't have a lot of weight when we think of the basics of the gospel because our faith depends on that very fact. And so we have to think clearly about which model providence rules that out and which model providence actually keeps that in. I do think that the non-risky models like Molinism and Calvinism do the best at keeping gospel where it's supposed to be. Like we consider God morally praiseworthy for basically determining the torture and death of an innocent human being. He had, as you said, his morally sufficient reasons for doing that, and we obviously reap the benefits. I
mhm.
don't think open theism and simple foreknowledge can quite get that in their system.
I think that there's
Um,
like maybe a balance that God has where it might be terrible for one person or one group, but overall good of humanity, it's an overall like positive, and that some decisions have to be made like that.
um,
Because I was thinking of like the people that got swallowed up in the wilderness, like that whole generation. God could have easily allowed them in and made them wildly successful in what they're trying to do, but God didn't. And I think in the long run, that was better for the Israel that those people didn't make it in, that the new generation is going to be more obedient and be willing and able to do the things that they needed to do to be successful. And God kind of knew that beforehand, obviously, and they like sinned and disobeyed and all this other stuff, lacked faith. Um, so it was terrible for those people, but good for the nation of Israel in the long run because it all ultimately got them to the goal. That makes sense. It's kind of a bad example because they
Uh,
did something wrong to kind of deserve it. But I mean, being scared because there's giants there, God kills you because you were basically scared of doing something, which,
I want to lean like more like towards a consequentialist view, like God looking at solely the consequences and then determining off of that. Um, I'd rather say that when we sin, we deserve judgment, and when we don't sin, we don't deserve judgment. But as it happens, we always sin. And so
yeah,
it's just his mercy that restrains it, and he has his good purposes. I think that's as much as we know, and I don't feel comfortable speculating too much on God's plan that way because all we know is his overall plan is to redeem mankind and be glorified with him. How he does that is, I think, in his right. If
yeah,
that makes sense. So, I can move on if you want.
yeah, let's go.
So, quick, the objections to open theism. I think the primary objection to open theism is our transworld deprivation. And the reason why I think this is because the open theist motivation for claiming the open theist providence primarily to escape the fact that God is culpable for sin in the world. Because they want to say that if God knew with certainty that there would be sin in the world, God is culpable for creating a world when he could have easily not created a world and been perfectly loving and just no matter what. But because on the non-risky models of providence, if he created a world and he actually knew evil would prevail, then God is culpable. That's what they usually want to say. And I've met many, many open theists that say this. And I don't think this is a good objection here or a good grounding for open theism. And here's why. Because if something like transworld deprivation is true, that can be located in God's natural knowledge. So, in other words, remember the three models of God's knowledge. There's natural knowledge, what God could do, or sorry, what God could know. So that's God's natural knowledge, what God could know, logical possibilities, and so forth. There's middle knowledge, which Molinists affirm, what God would know, what any free creature would do. And then God's free knowledge, which virtually all theists would agree, what God knows what free creatures will do. Okay. Except for the open theists, they don't believe in exhaustive foreknowledge, but they would still say that God knows what free creatures will do at this instant, because he's super smart and he can figure that out. And obviously, you know what's happening in the present, right? But that aside, I don't think the open theist objection here works. If the trans world deprivation is in God's natural knowledge, open theists themselves cannot escape the fact that God knew evil would prevail. Why? Because if they hold to God's natural knowledge of God knowing what could happen, and if transworld deprivation is located in God's natural knowledge, then it follows that the open theist God did know what could happen. In other words, the open theist God definitely knew that sin was an actual possibility before the creation of the world. And so, if they want to say, no, God didn't know that sin was an actual possibility, then I would say, no, they knew it was an actual possibility with certainty, even. Because given transworld deprivation, that's a thing. That it is certain that because we're not like God, we would fall. We will fall. And so anything that God creates that's not him, especially if it's an ontological being that shares his image, obviously we're going to fall. And so if that was in God's natural knowledge, the open theist also needs to hold to that. I hope that makes sense. And so that underneath their own lights would make God culpable. So even underneath their own system, God would be culpable for creating the world, even if God didn't exhaustively know the future. It's pretty damaging, I think. It's pretty damaging. And even, let's just say I didn't grant that. So let's just say I didn't grant the fact that, transworld deprivation was in God's natural knowledge. I let them have that, and I just took that whole objection away. Still, If God is super smart, I cannot see how he did not know at all that evil would be a thing, especially since it's the direct opposite or ontological inverse or negative of goodness. I cannot fathom that God didn't know what the absence of good would be, right? In his natural knowledge. And even if it was a mild 10% that God knew that, oh yeah, Adam and Eve, if I created them, yeah, they would somehow embody this absence of good and sin while eating the fruit, then isn't that 10% still culpable underneath their own system? Like, where's the threshold here? Does God need to know that evil would prevail 50% of the time, or 30%, or is it like 90%, or is it just certainty, right? But anything less than certainty, it's okay. So like 1 degree less than certainty, it's okay. It's okay, and God's not culpable. But 1 degree more, He is culpable. I hope you're following with me.
No, I
But
am.
this
It's
it
kind
doesn't
of
make
a
sense when you start putting it together. And it's like, where's this threshold here? We demand that threshold, right? Because that's where
yeah.
their argument depends on.
And I'm sitting here thinking like I wouldn't want a God who got caught off guard by this stuff. And if you think about it, the only way to answer your question and to keep um intellectually honest would be say that God had no idea that it was going to happen.
Yeah,
That's how he's
exactly.
not culpable at all. And I'm just like, so all of this since the fall, it's like, my
One big
bad,
risk.
guys. My
Yeah,
bad.
it's one big
I
risk.
didn't know it was going to happen. Don't blame me for it. I know I created all of it. I had no idea. I'm just like, that to me feels like something that the serpent would use in like the end times to rally people against God. Is like he had no idea he was going to do all this. He's the reason there's all this suffering in the world. He started it. He created it. We're all just simply
He would
like,
still be culpable for that.
yeah, he would be culpable. It'd be his fault, and it's like he just turned a blind eye to it. And it's like, I don't know, other stuff. It's like an old, you know, decrepit king whose eyes don't work, and he doesn't see the evil that's staring right at his feet. I'm just like,
Even think about this.
I think
Even
God
if,
works like that.
let's just say Adam and Eve did sin, he had no idea, and he's like, oh crap. Wouldn't he know, like, right before Adam and Eve sin, like, oh, there's a serpent down there. Maybe I should intervene. Then if they say that no, God can't do that because he needs them to learn, right? He needs them to learn through their own choices. Well, then what you're tacitly saying at the same time is you need evil in order to build your own soul. Guess what? That's completely compatible with Calvinism. Like, so what you're basically saying is you do need evil to build your own soul. You need the possibility to choose evil over goodness in order to choose your soul. You need morally significant actions. The only way to do that is if you have evil as a possibility. If you knew that before he created the world, then still underneath your own lights, God is culpable. So I really don't see how the open theist paradigm here rescues any amount of God's goodness that they want to rescue. To me, I mean, to put kindly and respectfully, it's really just straight asinine when you start putting it together.
It's like he's a good instead of God. That when you talk about like personal reservations about theological, this is one definitely have personal against
Yeah,
keeping God's goodness intact against all odds. Like no matter what, like the goodness can't be lost at all.
yeah,
Because the goal right there in the first place, it's not even goodness. It's just what you think goodness is. That's it. It's just your definition of it and how you understand it. It's not goodness in an ultimate sense in the first place. And then I also would say I would never want to believe in a God who just screwed this up on accident. Like that to me is unfathomable. That's a pill I could never swallow. Theologically.
And to them, it's not even like a pill. It's just the way it is. They
And that's, I
take
don't know what's worse. That they don't
take
see
the
how damning
Bible
it is, or I don't know.
they take the Bible super literally, and so like God can't know the future, or God is actually surprised, like in Genesis 6, like with the Tower of Babel, like he repented for he felt sorry for creating man and everything. Um, I think those are just analogy claims because classical theism is a thing, and God is super incomprehensible, and so you have to use language to describe him in such a way that we can understand. But they take those passages extremely literally, and so they do want to say, yeah, God is actually sorry in that passage for creating man, and that he wished he actually never did create man. And so it does sound a lot like infralapsarianism when you think about it. But then you have other passages where, Ephesians 1:11, where everything works according to the counsel of his own will. You have many passages in Isaiah that says God declares the ends from the beginning. Then you have passages in Revelation, and even more in Ephesians and Romans 8, that everything's predestined according to God's word, and that we are predestined, our salvation is predestined. How's that work underneath an open theist frame? We can go on and on, but I just want to give a tentative objection to I don't think open theism is the right model here for what
Yeah.
we want to preserve.
And I would agree, honestly. And this would probably be like, I'm pretty sure I've said this before. It's the furthest. It's the furthest thing, like, or the least likely of all. Um, I'd
It
never.
is.
I would never say like, oh, it's it's heresy. It's completely in antithetical to what the Bible teaches. I don't know that per se. Um, it's antithetical to how I understand the. That doesn't mean that my framework isn't accurate. But I would be, if an angel came down tonight and looked me in the eyes and said, "Open theism is exactly how God operates," I would just be shocked. I would just be like flabbergasted. Be like, okay, I guess like I'll roll with it if you say I have to, but then I'd also think in the back of my head that's probably a demon. I'm
Yeah,
messing around here, but I
it
wanted to
is.
say like the one point of, and I'm pretty sure I've repeated this before, but like me personally, this would be a personal tie to my theological worldview. I have to believe in a God who sees and understands and controls evil on an extremely intimate level. I feel like I probably do that because there's so much evil in the world that I've experienced personally. You can just see the stories online and stories throughout history.
Mhm.
I don't want a God who's unaware of those things, who's caught off guard by those things, who doesn't understand those things on an intimate level. You know what I mean? Like I feel like God needs to be part, not like a reason those things happen, but he needs to understand them intimately,
Yeah.
so
The
that's
the
just where my
objection
mind's at.
usually is, yeah, I agree with you 100%. The objection that we usually hear is, and we're going to be graphic. I'm going to be graphic at least because usually the objection is graphic. If Calvinist determinism is true, God is decreed every moment you watch pornography, every rape, every murder, right? These are horrendous evils, I think. More so socially, obviously, rape and murder are socially more horrendous than pornography, but in God's eyes, they're horrendous nonetheless.
Yeah.
And so, how can we believe a God that determines these things? Well, first of all, he determines them differently, and we're going to get to that later through a deficient means. But second of all, I agree with you 100% that in my own, and I've actually was there. If anyone's listening, I was there with a lot of those evils that Shamez is probably thinking of or have.
Murdered someone?
Oh, not those, but you
Okay.
personally, your evils, right? The
Yeah.
evils that you've experienced. I was there because we obviously grew up together. We didn't have great family lives, as we said in episode 1, and so this has really impacted our lives, knowing that God is there in the storm. Though he caused it for a reason.
Yeah.
And so for me, let's just say, I do something really horrendous and evil, like towards my wife, like I hit her or something. I've never hit her, never planned to hit her. But I do that, even if it was determined by God, I'm confident as a believer that God can use that in our marriage to redeem something good. He
It
says
might
that
mean
literally in Job and in Romans 8.
and it might mean you going to jail for a long time and Diana
Exactly.
divorcing you and getting away from whatever toxic led to that.
Uh, And if I was a believer, I would know that that's the best good.
Yeah.
God would be working in my heart to tell me that this is the best good, that I cannot be abusing my wife, and I abused her, and so it was taken away
Yeah.
for that reason. And now I need to spend this time understanding who my real savior is and understanding myself and so forth. I mean, there's so many applications, right?
Yeah.
Um,
One very, very personal to me, and I apologize if I've said this before. Um, but with me, my mother putting us up in adoption when we were like babies, and then she passed away when I was just as she was getting her life together, back in contact with me, became a believer. All of these positive things were happening. Just got cut off, without notice, no heads up, nothing, no communication to me that even happened. And I remember sitting there like as an 8-year-old thinking, well, this obviously sucks. But even so, like I believe that God has a plan for this happening. This happened for a very specific reason that I would even say to this day, I don't necessarily know why or what good has come out of it, but I've wholeheartedly believed that my entire life. Um, all of these things happen for a good reason. Now you would say, obviously being put up for adoption, being abused a lot of my young childhood, and then my mother passing away just as she was getting her life together. Those are all awful things. But in my theological framework, I can confidently say that those things, although horrible, evil, nasty things that happen, in the long run, they will have a net positive on my life. And maybe not even my life personally. It might be through me and a positive impact on somebody else, somebody hearing my story, somebody just interacting with me,
even your
knowing my
own kids.
history. Yeah, my own kids. It might be a very negative thing for me my entire life. And I don't even see the positive, maybe not even this generation or the next generation. Who knows what it is, but I believe that that's the end goal, is something positive. And my theological framework allows for me to believe that confidently. If I was an open theist, I'd just be like, bad luck. It, you
I mean,
know,
really is. It's
it
not that
sucks.
old saying that everything happens for a reason. Honestly, that's not true underneath open theism
Yeah.
because God doesn't know the reason until it happens, and He has to therefore, after the fact, make the
Like
reason.
stitch something together to like
And
make it
sure,
okay.
we can grant that redemption, that stitch is glorious. Like
Yeah.
we can grant that. I'm all okay with granting that to them, but the issue is it's still after the fact.
Yeah.
God, like, and maybe to them they're like, "Oh, God's learning with me. He's actually there with me, and going through it exactly how I'm going through it." But I can say it's the same thing with Christ. Christ went through it, went through evil, though he didn't need to. He chose to, and he is the great sympathizer, and
Yeah.
he's omni-empathetic, right? So he can still empathize with our sin, though he has never sinned himself.
He doesn't
You
need to
don't need,
experience
he
your
didn't, you don't
personal
need
trauma.
exactly. You don't need. He doesn't need to learn about your own personal trauma the minute you're learning about it in order to empathize with you.
Yeah.
That's just not. Hebrews does not tell us that.
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise, I don't think why would the author in Hebrews say that verse that in Hebrews 4 that God is the great sympathizer. It make no sense, at least to me. But
And and this reminds me of the sermon that we had this last Sunday. And I'm sorry we're getting off track, but I'm enjoying the conversation. So I'm
that's
gonna
good.
keep going. Um it I would say as a Calvinist confidently, like, I live, get to hopefully somewhere in my 70s, 80s, and I pass away. And I hope that I'm still holding to this thought that the life that I've been living up to this point, and eventually when I pass away, that was the best possible version of what God wanted for my life. That might be in an extremely positive and significant way. I go on, lead a bunch of people to Christ, live a very godly life, a great example, raise my kids right, do everything correct. Or it could mean that I always, continue to struggle. Maybe I stay exactly how I am right now, or maybe I even get a little bit worse. I'm not a great father, not a great husband, and eventually, pass away somewhat alone and depressed and kind of away from my faith. I would still say that was probably still the best option that I personally had. And that's exactly how God wanted it to turn out. Even though you could easily say on a level playing field that was a net negative, how the rest of my life ended up. And that all of that good things that God gave to me, I like squandered and didn't do anything with my gifts. And while that may be true, in an overall sense, but I would say within my life, even just as far as I live now, that I've done enough good things to justify being a Christian, I suppose. Like I know that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but like even if I died tomorrow, I would feel extremely happy and content with how my life turned out as a Christian so far. I'm losing my train of thought. So yeah, so even if like say let's just for a biblical example, I was thinking the sermon that we had last Sunday was about Jacob, and he was the one who got thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, right? That was him, Jacob. No, who was it? Joseph, the other J. And he ended up going to prison. He ended up, they lied about him trying to, sleep with somebody, and yada yada. All these negative things happened to him. I think he was almost 40 years old before he started seeing positive things happen in his life. And then obviously he ended up second in command and got his family moved to Egypt and saved them from famine and all those good things. So you could even see that's a very good example of like horrible thing, horrible thing, horrible thing, horrible thing. And then in the long run, you can see how those horrible things played out perfectly to put him in the position that God wanted him so that he could save his family from famine and ultimately keep the nation of Israel intact and safe in Egypt and actually survive through that famine, which led to them leading Egypt and all those other things. So you could see that's a perfect example of what we're talking about. Is God using negative situations to create net positives? I don't see God, as Joseph's going through these, being like, "Oh crap! Like we got to do something to get him out of here. What do we do?
What can I do
Make
to raise
Nebuchadnezzar
them?
have a dream, and then we'll let Joseph interpret the dream. Maybe that'll work. Maybe that'll get him out." It's like I don't think God works like that. I think God knew the only way that the nation of Israel is going to stay intact is if I have somebody in Egypt with the political authority to let them in and take them in and feed them and take care of them. How does that happen? Well, Joseph's got to go through all these things to have the skills, the talent, the social know-how, wisdom, the perseverance, like all of these different things. How do we get Joseph there? He's got to go through all these different things to get there ultimately. I don't know. To me, I'm like, that makes perfect sense. And in a weird way, I feel like a Joseph in the making myself. And I would say any Christian who is, seeking to live out a life glorifying in Christ is in their own little or major way going through similar things that Joseph went through.
Yeah, Genesis 50:20. God, what you, his brothers, intended for evil, God is intended for good. And that word intended on both, the Hebrew word, is the exact same. Exact same. So in the same way, his brothers intended for Joseph to be, to be sold in slavery. They intended it for evil. God intended it for good from the beginning. And so that signifies a divine plan. Divine plan that cannot be thwarted, corrupted, changed. Something that was going on in order to preserve what his promise earlier, Adam and Eve, make a savior, bring a savior, and he needed the nation of Israel in order to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That was the beginning of the nation of Israel. I
I
love it.
mean, that's the whole story of the Bible, honestly, like wrapped up in a simple, like little rant. And to me, I'm like, I'm reading all these things, learning about it my whole life, and it's always made perfect sense to me that that's how it is. Like these other concepts didn't even, I wasn't even considering them as an option until wild theories came out that I started learning about like in high school and college, and now a lot more with Colt. And it's just like I don't know if they're just missing the blessing or
We
the
can like do a podcast episode on it, but I really do think that it's not that they have the gospel confused, it's that I think that these other views don't appreciate the gravity of the gospel. Because I don't think they appreciate the gravity of their own sin. And I think that's where Calvinism, I do think, gets it right. They understand the gravity of their own sin, the weight and the seriousness of what it does to God's heart. That when you start with the idea of total depravity in the way the Calvinists understand it, I mean, really, the other four, the unlimited or unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, they just kind of fall
Mhm.
logically. I think that's really what it boils down to. That's, like I said, a whole nother podcast episode. So
I'm talking a lot. Let's move on.
we stopped with open theism. Let's do simple foreknowledge. Simple foreknowledge is a little bit more complicated. I'm going to explain because I'm doing internal critiques, which means I have to explain how they, uh, like what motivates their own view, and then inside that motivation, I try to rip it open. That's exactly what I did for the open theist, and that's what I'm going to do here for the simple foreknowledge. One of the biggest motivations for the simple foreknowledge thesis is that God knows what you will do after He creates it, after He creates the world. But the objection usually goes, well, how could you be free if God knows what you will do? God doesn't possess any false knowledge, right? So He knows all true propositions. And if if He creates the world and the future is actually true because He knows it, and He doesn't, because He knows it, He doesn't have any false propositions. That means it will happen. And if it will happen, then how could you do otherwise? In other words, how could you actually be free if it will happen, right? They want to hold to something like indeterministic freedom, the ability to do otherwise, and this garden of forking paths, while at the same time holding that God doesn't determine um, um, the the creation, and while also saying that God knows what they will do. So they try to give an account for how God knows what they will do, but yet they still have this indeterministic freedom. So far, so good, I hope.
Yeah.
How do they do that? How do they come up with a model in which God knows what they will do, yet they still have this freedom worth preserving? It doesn't just go to Calvinist determinism. Well, come up with what is called a Frankfurt style example. They come up with a rather strong Frankfurt style example called blockage Frankfurt style examples. So to recap, because I believe I've said this before previously, but a Frankfurt style example is rather new in the philosophical literature. It came out in 1969 by a man named Harry Frankfurt. So he tried to show that this thesis, PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities, is actually false. What the PAP says is that in order to be held morally responsible, you have to be uh, able to do otherwise. So you could also say something like, in order to be free, you have to be able to do or you have to be able to do otherwise, and that's kind of what the simple foreknowledge theist wants to do. Anyways, they look at these resources and like, aha, this is a great model, and so they try to adopt the model. Here's a simple case of what a Frankfurt style example is, and then I'm going to try to explain the blockage Frankfurt style, and then I'm going to try to show how they use that in order to get what they want out of this model. After that, I want to show why it doesn't work. Okay? So here's the basic model. The basic model is something like this. I use it all the time. Let's just say I want my wife to get me a Coke out of the refrigerator. And I know that she's sneaky and she wants me to drink more healthy drinks like a LaCroix. So what I do, unbeknownst to her, in the middle of the night, before, the day before I ask her to get me a Coke, I put an electrode microchip in her brain. And that allows me to kind of signal in her brain that if she were to go and get a LaCroix, I can see that on my little iPad and then change it real quick so that she gets me a Coke. So here's how the actual sequence works. The next day, I was like, "Oh, honey, can you give me a Coke?" "Sure, dear, I love you." She gets up. I kind of like look around. I'm like, "Okay, bring out my iPad. What is she going to do?" And then she goes to the fridge. I'm monitoring it, monitoring it, monitoring it. And she actually does go for the Coke. Great. I don't need to do anything. I don't need to change her brain states so that she actually gets me the Coke. She does it on her own. That's the actual sequence of events. She gives me the Coke. I'm happy. Everything's all said and done. I didn't intervene at all. I did not intervene at all. She did it on her own. The alternative sequence is this. She goes to the fridge. I look at my iPad. I'm monitoring, monitoring. But yet I see somehow, because I'm a good judge of things, and I see on my little iPad, oh my gosh, she's about to go for the LaCroix. So what do? I change it real quick. So as she's going for the LaCroix, she goes for the Coke, and then she brings me back the Coke. "Here you go, dear." "Oh, thanks, honey. I love you." What didn't she have? She did not have the alternative to do otherwise. Yet, intuitively, we want to say that she's still morally responsible in the actual sequence of events. So, in the actual sequence of events where I did not intervene, where I didn't do anything, I just monitored her. She got the Coke for me on her own. In that sequence, we want to say she's morally responsible. But in that sequence, did she have the ability to do otherwise? Well, it seems like she didn't, right? Because if she were to do otherwise, I would have just changed her brain states and then she would have, the consequence would still be the same. She would have gotten me a Coke. So this is what we call a Frankfurt style example. And it's supposed to be a negation of the principle called the PAP, that she is morally responsible, though she didn't have the ability to do otherwise. She is free, though she didn't have the ability to do otherwise. How are we feeling so far? I hope that's good enough.
We've been through it.
Yeah.
At least
So blockage, yeah. So a blockage case is just a stronger case in which it basically eliminates all these possible alternatives, because maybe you could say, oh, she could try to go for the LaCroix, or maybe she could try to go for orange juice instead. Maybe she could try to go for water because that's more healthy than all of them. What a blockage case does is it basically blocks out all those alternatives. So her neural pathways in her brain, let's just say she has one neural pathway going to orange juice, another neural pathway going to water, another neural pathway going to LaCroix and Coke. I block off all the other neural pathways. So the only neural pathway available to her is the Coke. She doesn't complain. She gets me the Coke in the actual sequence, and I don't intervene at all. And we still want to say that she's pretty much morally responsible. Well, I bring all this up, and it's a lot of jargon, but I bring all this up because the simple foreknowledge theist wants to use that model in order to say, oh, me being God, the counterfactual intervener, I know what she will do, and she couldn't do otherwise, though she's free, quote unquote, because she does it on her own, right? She can be libertarianly free. So that is how God can know what the future creatures will do, though they are still free. So that's kind of how they use the model. Okay? Here's the problem. Those advocates of those examples want to claim that the agent couldn't do other than what God has foreknown, yet the agent still possesses something like libertarian freedom. But the problem is libertarian freedom entails indeterminism. And if an indeterminism by definition entails alternative possibilities. But that very blockage Frankfurt style case eliminates all the alternative possibilities. So question, If the agent cannot do anything other than what they do, how is this libertarian freedom? And if the alternative possibilities are blocked off, then it seems determinism just naturally follows, even in the midst of their own example. So even though they want to claim indeterminism, to use a model like this, they're actually claiming determinism, which is just what the Calvinist wants to affirm, right? And if they want to say, oh, you can be determined, yet everything's cool and she's free, great. The Calvinists can say the same thing. So how is this any different? So this is my basic objection to the simple foreknowledge thesis. It's pretty intense. It's probably the most complicated of all the objections, but I hope it suffices.
Calvinist saying,
I mean, um,
or
I
at
think
least
so.
a part of it blows my mind to be like, God knows what will happen, but you're sitting
Mhm.
here saying, yeah, no different than I agree with you.
yeah, yeah, and so I think it's the onus is on them to kind of come up with like
How's that
um,
different than determined?
yeah, a relative difference
Yeah.
because I don't see a relative difference between. And honestly, Calvinists are not the only ones to point that out. Actually, most incompatibilists have actually pointed that out. Even more actually, and more interestingly, David Hunt is a big proponent of this kind of argument. He wants to hold to simple foreknowledge, and he uses this kind of Frankfurt style case in order to argue that you can be free, though you can't do otherwise because God knows what you'll do. He even concedes that it does seem like a case of determinism. He actually says in his book, I don't really know another way around it. So though it seems like a case of determinism, he doesn't think it matters too much. And I'm just like, what do you mean? What do you mean it doesn't matter too much? You just conceded that you can be determined and yet free. That's compatibilism, buddy. That's not libertarian freedom. So it's bizarre. But I'm good to move on to the next one. It's your favorite one. Molinism. Oh my gosh. Love it. Yeah.
Oh,
And then we need to make the case for why determinism is better. Because just because those fall doesn't mean determinism is automatically in, you know? So Molinism has a lot of objections over the literature. Molinism is the idea that God has middle knowledge and that humans have libertarian free will. So God knows what a libertarian free creature would do in any given circumstance, and then he actualizes that world. So while in the actual world, you can still say you're libertarianly free, or that's what they argue, though you could not do other, or though God is completely omniscient because he knows the future and he knows what could happen, he knows what will happen. It's just that he knows also what would happen before he created the world. The number one objection to Molinism is what is called the grounding objection. And I honestly find this pretty persuasive, but it's a vast amount of literature on the topic, so I'll only scratch the surface. But here's what it says. The grounding objection presses the fact that how can God come to know, or how can God come in contact with knowing what free creatures would do? How how does he know this? So basically, is it kind of a claim against? It's an objection against the very claim of middle knowledge. Middle knowledge says that God knows what free creatures would do before he created any of them. So they kind of have this, they're kind of pre-existent in God's mind. So that truth of what they would do, where is this grounded in? It's not grounded in God, or otherwise they would say it's determinism, because as we'll see, we believe God determined everything, and that's how God knows what would happen, or what will happen. But to them, if that happened, then it would be tantamount to determinism, and Molinists believe in libertarian freedom, so they don't obviously can't hold that. But still, how does God know what libertarian free creatures would do in any hypothetical circumstance before creation and before free creatures even existed? So to me, it would seem question begging to simply assert that God is omniscient and therefore he knows. But given the traditional definition of omniscience above, how does God know that? The traditional definition that we did on 2 episodes ago said that God knows all things that are logically or otherwise metaphysically possible for God to know. But you need to show that it is possible for God to know what free creatures would do. If they just say, well, God just knows it, how? You demand a reason for this. And without that reason, it's just question begging. So I think that's the biggest objection against Molinism here.
For them to simply answer, how does
We're still patiently waiting, to be honest. They say something like, "Oh, the contemporary Molinists like William Lane Craig want to say that God just knows brute facts. That libertarian free creatures doing what they do is just a brute fact, basically that they can just know it. But how does God know it? It's not really necessary for him to know how, for us to know how he knows it. He just knows it. To me, it just question begging still. And then Molina, the person who originally came up with Molinism, like 400 years ago, he used something called super comprehension. Like God can super comprehend like hypothetical situations.
I'm
To
just like,
me, it's
where are
like,
you getting that?
how does God super comprehend what free creatures would do? I can still ask the same question over and over and over again. Like, how? How does he know? And so,
The explanation raises another question.
mm,
Not what question begs.
yeah. Question begging is just relying on your conclusion in order to
Yeah.
use your conclusion in order to prove your own conclusion. So
Every
you're
answer
basically,
every answer they get, we can accurately say how. Just
yeah,
on repeat.
yeah.
And that's
That's
like
the problem.
where's the biblical literature on that? I'm like, that's a purely like philosophical conclusion. I don't see
Yeah, it
it in
is.
scripture.
Um, there is some sort of scriptural references of some subjective conditionals, like David. I'm thinking in like Second Samuel that God said, "If you were to do this, then this would not happen. If you were
Yeah.
to go to this city, Saul wouldn't do this." But that to me doesn't necessarily show creaturely freedom. It just shows that God knows conditionals. God doesn't need creaturely freedom to know conditionals. That's just necessary. God doesn't need like middle knowledge in order to know that if I drop salt in water, it would dissolve. Obviously, would dissolve. That's the disposition of salt, right? So he could just say, God knows the disposition of Saul. That if David were to do this, then Saul would not do that. That doesn't mean that David is somehow libertarianly free. So
Isn't in a way the same exact thing at the point we were just talking about simple foreknowledge was saying? Simple foreknowledge is like God knows beforehand what
mhm.
free creatures would do. Middle knowledge. God knows
uh,
what free creatures would do. I
yeah.
guess will or would is different. But does that
But
word
we still demand an answer. So
yeah, that word doesn't change the
at least simple foreknowledge tries to give a reason as to okay, how can God know? Yet they can't do other than what God knows. Yet they can still be free. So I can at least respect that. I just don't think
okay.
their model works. But Molinism gives no such model. And even if they did give a model, something like I know um, some Molinists have tried to give something like a blockage Frankfurt style case where it is the case where they don't have the ability to do otherwise. It completely goes against Molina's original of what middle knowledge is.
Okay,
He was
so
adamant about libertarian free will in middle knowledge. You had to have the ability to do otherwise. Frankfurt style cases do not give you that. Even if they
God
appealed to that, it wouldn't matter.
would know what. So
Yeah.
what would that actually look like? How would you make a model a circumstance that occur? Because it's almost an absurd prop if you think about it.
Um, so I think this goes really good with our next objection, and
Okay.
it's what I call the jukebox analogy,
All right, hit me.
and I think this is really true. So a model could be like this. Let's just say Queen is developing their new album, you know, in the 80s or whatever. Let's go back to the 80s where jukeboxes were an actual thing. And they were developing their new song. They're like, you know, have the libertarian free will to mess around, try new sounds, blah, 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 like they normally did. Develop this album, they record it. It's great, right? They all did libertarian free stuff while making that song. You publish the song. You go to the jukebox. You see all these different songs you could choose, but instead you pick on Bohemian Rhapsody. Now,
Right.
question: when Bohemian Rhapsody is actually being played, could Queen do otherwise? Could literally the artist in the CD do other than what that song has been published to sing and to play?
Now it's a record.
Yeah, it's a recording because it's freaking published. So I would say the Molinist could say yes. Previously, they could do otherwise, and that could be a model. But to me, the model again falls apart because what happens when the world is published? God actualized this world. We're no longer located in God's middle knowledge. We are now in God in the actual world after God has decreed it. So in the actual world, could you do otherwise, my Molinist friend? I think they have to be able to say no, that I could not do otherwise. And I've been accused of question begging here from other Molinists, and I think it's absurd because I'm assuming their worldview. They want to say that they could do otherwise based on their libertarian freedom. But if I just give a simple model to say, hey, when the world is published, just like in the jukebox analogy, when the world is published, could you do other than what you do? I think you have to be able to say no here. Because you say no, do you have libertarian freedom? And if you don't have libertarian freedom, then the whole project of middle knowledge, which depends on libertarian freedom, falls. So does God have middle knowledge after all? Well, it doesn't seem like he does. If he doesn't have libertarian if we don't have libertarian freedom, then why would God need middle knowledge? It would be just basically taking two steps when you could just take one step. If that makes sense.
I mean, my first, because you could easily performing it live, affected way, of course, because they're
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
homemade though. There up
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the song. So while it's being performed, the way that that's about, God would know exactly how that played entire time.
Yeah, but I don't see how that works because Molinism depends on possible worlds. So the analogy says there are possible songs that God could choose. All of them are good. He dwindles out through the possible songs, through feasible songs that he thinks are the best for whatever for whatever the person choosing the song thinks. In this case, I'm God, and I'm choosing the song that I think best actualizes my mood or something. I don't know. Whatever, however God wants to choose, and he chooses that one song, that one actual world. And then as that song is playing, we're now past me choosing and past me knowing what the lyrics would be. I know, because I'm a great Queen fan, I know what the lyrics would be. So as I know that perhaps they had libertarian free will before I started playing the song. After I played the song, as it's playing right now, because it's published, the question is, do they have the ability to do otherwise? I think they have to say no here. If they say
Would
no, then their system falls.
almost be God's, say it, his his art of knowing have to be happening simultaneously with the actions that are happening, or the actualization is happening not
Hmm.
beforehand.
Yeah.
Or you could say that that whole process happens, the different scenarios, paths, yada yada yada, and God choosing one and rolling with it happening simultaneously.
I still don't think that's adequate to middle knowledge. So I
That
fail to see why that would be a relevant difference.
it wouldn't. I don't know if it would, because that's, how is that any different than any seeing, understanding
Yeah.
this? You want to say like time is not an issue here. Say that this whole process might, could
No,
have happened
because
in the, well, even if it happened in the past, we're right at the same spot.
the Molinists would usually want to say that God is now, so he's omnitemporal. So in other words, they want to say that God can take on time or not take on time. Since he created the world, he takes on time. He has actually taken on time now, so he's in time, whereas before he was outside of time. After he created the world, he's in time, but he's not going to go back to being outside time and looking at all the other possible worlds. This world is still actualized. This is still the actualized world. Could you have done otherwise? This is called an anti-Molinist argument. It's not new to the literature, so I'm
Yeah.
just using it. Like many philosophers have tried to come up with something similar, and it's honestly, to me, it's the bread and butter to anti-Molinists or non-Molinists because it's used all the time. They want to say that you could do otherwise, but God weakly actualizes the world. Actualize the world. I mean, the open theist literally compares Molinists with determinists for this exact reason, because it's still actualization.
Yeah, that's the thing that kills me,
So,
because in order for this model to work, you would have to, the actualization mechanism has to be done by the creatures, not
uh-huh.
God.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah,
only way it
exactly.
works.
Yeah.
Trying to think like, God, this is gonna be stupid. How do I don't know how to put it in more terms. Maybe you can. I was thinking of God, your dumb smile is like frozen on the screen for a second. Okay, so do you remember, I think it was in the Hercules stories where you have like the witches and the threads of time, and when somebody dies they like cut that thread, like, and their line in the tapestry of time is over when it gets cut. Do you know that story in like the ancient Greek mythology?
Yeah.
Somebody, I don't know the details of it. But I was thinking like the Frankfurt style example is pretty much if those lines are choices that God has cut all the different threads and there's only one thread left that could be actualized. All the others are cut, blocked.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, our worldview would be there's only one thread the entire time. There's nothing being cut or decided on. An open theist would say like the threads all have existed and nothing's being cut. They're just naturally like withering away and we have no idea. No one's actually in charge. We're kind of all seeing it in real time. Like God is not cutting any. I would say like middle knowledge would kind of be like they know which one is going to be actualized, but they would still, like God would still, in order to preserve libertarian free will, not cut anything at all. They would have to naturally wither away like it would in open theism. So the mechanism of control is just not there. There would have to be no control, which therefore there'd have to be no actualization on God's part in order for libertarian free will. You can't say God actualizes the present and you're still libertarianly. Those are
That's exactly what
incompatible ideas.
that's exactly what the open theist says. That's why they disagree. So William Hasker is probably the number one philosopher against Molinism, and he has used that exact. Obviously, it's way more sophisticated, right?
I mean,
But
I'm
he
pulling
has
this out
used
of my butt, so give me a
no,
break.
like he no. I'm saying is it's right on the money because he used the exact same argument that it's still actualization. You're still having God actualize a set of circumstances, and in the actual world, could you have done otherwise? He's still so this what I'm saying is this objection is not new to the literature. It's actually pressed heavily. This is what open theists say to Molinists. That's no different than determinism. That's if it's no different than determinism, you might as well have a strong deterministic model like Calvinism does, then just try to show, okay, can we still be free in some relevant sense? And that would be compatibilism, not libertarianism. Then if that happens, why do you need middle knowledge? It would be the motivation for middle knowledge would be useless. So
But the motivation for middle knowledge is like mixing oil and water. Like it
yeah,
makes for a crappy drink and eventually it doesn't really mix at all if you let it sit for a while.
they want a strong model of providence while still having a strong model of human freedom. The problem is this: they have to give one way or another. They give on the strong model of providence so that they can have a strong model of human freedom, libertarian freedom. We give, because we're the next step down, Calvinist determinism, we give a strong model of providence while forsaking a strong model of freedom. It's still meaningful. Compatibilist freedom is still meaningful and we're still responsible, but it's not nearly as strong as libertarian freedom. Not nearly as strong at all.
I
I'm
hate
okay
that
with that.
word. I hate that word strong because that's not really indicating
Bold.
it.
How about that?
No, it's like because I would say that we still preserve a strong um
You still preserve the
a,
necessities for our freedom.
I would
So
it's
the
I would say
moral
we still have
responsibility.
a strong sense of freedom. Do not have any sort of libertary, and I think that that's a significant difference. Like I would never say that we're free to do whatever we want and that
Yeah, I
we're
think
the
I agree.
main, like we're um the only source of action. I would
Mhm.
say that that's never the case. We are a source of action, cocktail of circumstances, the Holy Spirit, and your own personal desires.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I still think maybe the word bold. So I think libertarianism wants to say that they have a bold claim that I could actually actualize alternative A, B, C, D, and I am also the source of actualizing alternative A, B, C, D, uh, each of which is compatible with my nature. So that is a bold claim. That's what I mean by strong. We don't make such a bold claim because we just put the truth value of what we do and the sufficiency of what we do in God's hands. But it is strong in the sense that, yes, it's meaningful and we still preserve moral responsibility and we can still say we're free. That's what compatibilism entails. So in that sense, yeah, I agree.
Like if the cocktail would be, we would say it's a third and a third and a third. Be like it's like 90, 2-3 or
Yeah.
95-5, I should say. So in that sense, I get why we use the word strong. It just kind of makes it makes it sound like to a layman that it would be like, oh, you can't believe in freedom if you're a Calvinist.
Because you have a weak, yeah, you have a
A
weak.
weak sense of it, like, oh, like I obviously have freedom. That's going to turn a lot of people off. But it's like, no, we have a strong sense of freedom. We have a extremely non-existent, weak sense of libertarian freedom. So I don't know. There's no better way to say that, but I feel like that's the more accurate statement. I don't know.
That's okay. I have two other objections here, but I kind of want to skip one and just, for the sake of time, go to another one.
Sure.
Um, so the one that I kind of want to go through is called Welty's gunslinger analogy. This one's kind of fun.
So should be
So
good.
Welty's gunslinger analogy is rather new, but basically it says, okay, I'll grant that everything that the Molinist says about Calvinism, that Calvinism, determinism is bad because it implicates God into being the author of evil. Now, obviously, we don't say that. What Welty is trying to do is give a two co-q strategy. So two co-q means you two in the Latin. And so what that means is, okay, if we have the liability of God being held as the author of evil, so do you, the Molinist. Here's how he presents that. So that means this really only works against the Molinist. If the Molinist wants to say to the Calvinist, hey, you're the author of evil, God, underneath Calvinist determinism, but because we're Molinists, creatures have
Features.
creatures have, yeah, creatures have libertarian freedom. So God's not the author of evil. Haha, we win. Welty's trying to say, nuh-uh, you also have the same problem. Here's how. He gives two cases. An actual gun case, what he calls the ordinary gun case, straight up pistol, fire, boom, someone's dead. Okay, so just an ordinary gun case. And then he compares that or juxtaposes it with what's called the you hear my baby in the background
That's
probably,
fine.
but so he calls it with the bullet bill case. So if you remember from Mario, Bullet Bill, that bullet that would kind of like follow Mario around or whatever, and you had to kind of hop on it to. And so Bullet Bill is like considered an agent, and they can do what they want, right? And it can move around and choose. The consequence is still the same. So in other words, so while he doesn't say this in the original article, but I'm saying it. The event particulars, the specifics about what Bullet Bill does before he actually kills the person is different, and God doesn't actualize that. He doesn't know, or he does, but it's up to Bullet Bill's own volition. He's libertarianly free. But the consequence of Bullet Bill actually killing the man at the very end is still the exact same thing as the ordinary gun case. So, in other words, this is what we want to say. The Molinist wants to say that underneath the conditions of the ordinary gun case, and that gunman is morally responsible, so God is morally responsible. In the Bullet Bill case, what is the relevant difference between God being responsible there than in the ordinary gun case? Because the consequence is still the same. God knew that Bullet Bill would still kill that man, right? Does that make sense? And in the ordinary gun case, that's still the same thing, yes? So in the ordinary gun case, the man dies. In the bullet bill gun case, the man dies. In both cases, man dies. And the Molinist wants to say, oh, no, no, no. In the ordinary gun case, he's morally responsible. But in the bullet bill case, he's not. And then Welty's saying, so what's the relevant difference then? Because both are actualizing a set of conditions. Based on those conditions, that consequence would still happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's
You're
the
using,
overall argument.
yeah, like the argument done. So I was thinking like all the, because even
You can
if
apply it to that. You can
yeah,
apply it like that.
if you ask the Molinists why did the fall happen, they would say, correct me if I'm wrong, out of all the possibilities, this was the best one. This one brought the most glory to God, and that's why that's the one he actualized, because it brings the most good.
Yeah, that's what they would say. Yeah.
And we're sitting here saying, correct, sir. That's exactly what we've been saying this entire time.
Yeah.
We agree
And
on something.
it really goes back to the earlier objection with the open theist, that the open theist wants to say Molinism is actually just like Calvinism. And Molinism is like, no, 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 it's not the same thing, right? Now we have Calvinists actually saying to Molinists, no, it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. So everyone else is saying that Molinism is like Calvinism, like Calvinist determinism. The only one that's apparently not on the same boat is the Molinist.
And I'm just like, is there something that we're missing here? Like, I'm really trying to rack my head. Like, I feel like if it was this easy, then like if you
Well,
run into
so
this theological wall, how would you get over it? Like, you can't. Like,
interestingly,
you're boxed in.
Stratton has, our good friend Stratton has written numerous articles in response to Greg Welty and this article that he has written and published. And Welty has even responded back to Stratton, but Stratton has also responded back to him. It was a good discussion, but it was kind of cringy because the only thing Stratton kept saying as a Molinist kept saying is, no, no, but Bullet Bill is libertarianly free. He could do what he wants to do. And somehow that exculpates God. Somehow. But it's never said how. Because they say, oh, God, like, because Bullet Bill is the source. God still knew what Bullet Bill would do, and he actualized it anyways. He knew Bullet Bill would kill that man based on his own volition and did nothing to stop it. In fact, he actually actualized the set of conditions in order for it to happen. So how is God not morally responsible underneath the Molinist's own view? That's the question we need.
You know what? It's not us missing something from their argument. It's them missing something. That's why this
That's
is
why I
happening.
think, yeah.
Because we're basically saying, like, example with the fall. Say, well, that happened because Adam and Eve were libertarianly free, and God actualized it
Mhm.
because it was the best outcome. And
Mhm.
we would say, yeah, Adam and Eve were free, and that's why they chose, because God deficiently allowed them to make their own choice without any sort of influence on his end, which is why they chose what they chose, because God didn't force them to choose otherwise. And for whatever reason, this is a burden of proof that any Christian, I would say, has to answer. God thought that was best.
Yeah.
Now, we have a real argument with atheists about that. Sure, I'd love to have those conversations. But everybody else on the
You
Christian
shouldn't be
side,
having them with Christians.
yes. Because we all are stuck in that. Maybe the open theists are the only ones who have an out right now.
Not if transworld deprivation is true.
Well, there.
Because if
Well,
transworld deprivation is true, they knew that that evil would still obtain, right? And so God actualized the world even though evil would obtain, because he knew that free creatures or that creatures would ontologically be deprived, therefore sin would come about. So if even open theists Even if deprivation is true and that's located in God's natural knowledge, even open theists knew that. So they still have to answer the same question as all the other systems. So my wife calls this an ecclesiodicy because you're trying to give a reason, a defense against your own theist brothers. So ecclesia with the church and odyssey just meaning, or theodicy meaning justification. So why are we giving justifications to our own theist brothers when we should try to be ganging up on the atheist who has the same questions? Right? It's annoying. At least, and I've actually had atheists tell me this, at least the Calvinist is consistent and actually owns the problem, recognizes there is one, that their system falls to it, and then tries to give an answer. Whereas the other systems are just like, no, no, free will defense, we have it. It's annoying.
It's been the easy out for so long.
Yeah. That's Molinism. If you wanted to continue on or what?
Still trying to think if there's something we're missing here, and I just don't think there is. Like, I wish we had like a strong Molinist like in the podcast with us. Just be like, can you like help us
I
out
can
here?
arrange that. I can arrange that if you want.
I
I
kind
have
of
many Molinist
I
friends.
kind of want to, cuz like I'm not against having a third
No,
on the podcast, and I think the way we do it is it's an argument between you and them, and I'll be the arbiter, and if if they feel like I'm not being a fair judge, to call me out on it. It's actually something I thought about doing last week. Like, I think that'd be cool. Or if they weren't comfortable, they could bring their own um person to oversee the conversation if they would rather do that. They'd be more comfortable like that. So it'd be 2v2 instead of 2.
I don't like. Yeah, I have many Molinist friends. I wouldn't. I mean, I know most of them would probably feel comfortable
Yeah.
coming in and just discussing about it. I don't know if we would want to debate or anything, but
Yeah,
um,
it
they
I'm just
press the same things that I've been already saying. Like, it's inexplicable. It's a brute fact. I don't see why we need to know why God knows how free creatures would do this in any circumstance, or it's super comprehension. Like, it's pretty much the same kind of thing. And I'm still sitting there. One actually says, well, we don't say God's omnipotence. We don't ask how God is omnipotent, right? So if we don't ask how God is omnipotent, why do we have to ask how God just knows everything? You see what I'm saying? And to me, that's an okay objection. Here's the problem. The point of contention is not God's omnipotence. The point of contention is his omniscience. So obviously, if there's a point in contention, you need to prove it. No one, most theists at least, don't disagree that God knows or God can do all things that are logically or metaphysically possible for him to do. Most theists agree with this, at least Protestant theists. So that's not the point of contention. And then they were like, well, it is a point of contention to some other theists, like Hindus. Like that would be omnipotence is a point of contention for like Hindus and stuff. I'm just like, how does panentheism, like, that has nothing to do with Christianity. In fact, panentheism is completely against Christianity. Christianity entails monotheism. Right? So it doesn't
well,
entail panentheism.
here's what I
So
was
what
saying.
I'm demonstrating is
God.
all these different branches of different responses that a monist could do, and I just don't see how any of them necessarily work. That's what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
so if someone was in the call and said that, like, we don't know how it works and that should be a good enough answer, like, leave it up to it's one of those things that we don't understand or are incapable of understanding. Um I would just say back to them, like, well, why should I trust you on, like,
Or better yet, when they ask for a reason for how God can be completely determinative in our lives and how we can still be free, we can just say, "Oh, we don't have an answer, but we don't need an answer."
it shuts down the conversation,
It does.
essentially. So
They
let
would say, "Oh, you need an answer," and we would say, "Exactly, we need an answer, and the answer is compatibilism, and you need that answer too for your middle knowledge."
Well, there's your objection right there. And I would say, like, I'd even take it a step further. I'm just like, I really don't see, this concept being talked about or even shown in the Bible. It's a completely foreign concept to me. And I think philosophically, um, it kind of makes sense a little bit. Like, if this is true and that's true, then we can still have a sovereign God with a strong sense of freedom.
Mm.
If we can fit these two in there, like, yeah, like, I could see why you would want to believe that, because it gives you the best of both worlds.
Mm.
But those concepts are not compatible. I don't think, like, unless you just want to pretty much throw your hands up in the air and admit you're a compatibilist determinist, and
So
then you can have it. So I don't know.
the whole issue is they're trying to say God's foreknowledge and freedom and mankind's freedom are compatible. Calvinist
Oh, okay.
determinist says no, they're not. They're not compatible. At least not if you take freedom to be libertarian freedom.
Yeah.
Not compatible.
Yeah.
You can have freedom that is compatible with a strong sense of foreknowledge, and that is just compatibilism.
Yeah.
Right? So
All right. So let's move on.
those were the objections to the primary models of providence. And so if you want to, we can start moving on to
Yeah.
positive reasons for why Calvinist determinism should be accepted. Because just because we give negative reasons for why other models shouldn't be accepted, that doesn't mean our model should be accepted.
Yeah.
Right?
So
So we
get
should give positive reasons for why our model should be accepted.
start working your way through the Bignon quote. I'll be right back. I want you to go on.
Sure. So my favorite author from Calvinist side is Guillaume Bignon. He's written many books. One book I always have it on me is this: Excusing Sinners, Blaming God. Fantastic book. Obviously, I've read a lot of it, and I write in my books, contrary to some of my friends telling me not to write in the books, but I write in them. It helps me know it. And he's an awesome Calvinist philosopher. Fantastic. He's also French, so that may help it. I don't know. But he has written an argument, a brief pragmatic argument for Calvinist determinism. So basically, the idea is if compatibilism is true, then that means Calvinist determinism is more than likely true. And so what that means is determinism could in fact be an entailment for compatibilism, but it's only an entailment via application. So that's why he calls it a pragmatic argument. So in other words, compatibilism doesn't entail by definition determinism, but it can entail determinism through application. And that's what Bignon is trying to say. I am just going to read like a block quote here, and then I'm going to read the premises, mildly defend them, because I would love if Shamez put the link for his argument in the YouTube description. It's just, he has written an article on it. And to me, this is one of the best cases for determinism, that if compatibilism is true, then given these conditions, determinism is more than likely true. And it has to do a lot with risky providence and infralapsarianism and supralapsarianism, like we have explained. So here's the quote. Bignon says this: the debate on the nature of free will and the providence, uh, which has been showcased for centuries in the theological world between Arminians and Calvinists, have often been seen in the philosophical world to be between libertarians and compatibilists. And I would say that's true. Arminians are usually libertarians and Calvinists are usually compatibilists. But, Bignon says, while the thesis of libertarianism straightforwardly entails indeterminism, as affirmed by all Arminians, compatibilism, on the other hand, does not commit its Calvinist proponents to the truth of theological determinism, only to its compatibility with human moral responsibility, just like what I said. So compatibilism only entails that if determinism were true, and if responsibility were true, they are compatible. It says nothing about the truth of determinism. However, what Bignon wants to do is make a pragmatic argument that even if compatibilism is true, determinism probably follows. So he says, continuing, given this, even if Calvinist philosophers were to successfully establish compatibilism, the question of determinism would remain. Supposing the compatibilist arguments are successful, God could determine human choices without doing violence to human moral responsibility. But the question is, has he actually done that? Typically, Calvinists find support for this stronger contention in biblical exegesis. I know Shamez likes to try to think of that. I have a book by Lorraine Botner, Piper, Sproul, tons of other Calvinists have tried to do that. I don't, and neither does Bignon. And
Dumb. Sorry.
he says in the traditional philosophical arguments against indeterminism is usually where he wants to put his stake. Then he says the present argument aims to offer an alternative philosophical route, which is up my alley, based upon the purposelessness of evil in an indeterministic world. So the argument argues that God, as a maximally great being, would only permit or risk evil with morally sufficient reasons in the form of compensating good. So a great good coming out of it. And that if indeterminism were true, like libertarianism, at least some evil results from the misuse of libertarian free will alone, which thus serves no good purpose. The only good purpose is that you had the libertarian freedom to do what you do. But other than that, there was really no other good purpose that God can redeem from that. Bignon says this entails that unless libertarian free will is itself a necessary safeguard of moral responsibility or something like it, God would then not commit to it with its attached price tag of otherwise purposeless evil. From these premises, he says it is argued that determinism does follow from a robust compatibilism. If God could determine human choices, thereby securing purpose, like what we want to say, purpose in evil, while also preserving human responsibility, then he probably has. To me, that's phenomenal. That is like one of the best arguments I've ever seen, and I love Bignon so much. Okay, and so his actual argument, because that's kind of the summary, his actual argument is 6 steps. But I'm going to
Let's do
stop
it.
here and see if we have any. Are you good?
Yeah.
So I'll read all 6 steps, and then I'll kind of briefly explain some of the problems or some of the things Bignon envisions. But then we'll kind of go back to our earlier discussion on risk and non-risk providences, and it will kind of hopefully secure some of those premises. But again, if you ever want to read the article yourself and how Bignon defends them, I'm hoping Shamez will put it in the description. So
Yeah.
the first premise goes like this: God only ever permits or risks the existence of evil when he has sufficient reasons in the form of compensating goods. Open theists agree to this, Molinists agree to this, like everyone agrees to this. That's relatively uncontroversial. Number 2, if God leaves human choices undetermined, the world contains, or at least has been risked to contain, at least some evil whose sole rationale is to avoid determinism. So that is a pretty heavy premise. I'll come back to it, but premise 3 says this: there is no compensating good that comes from avoiding determinism. Now that's an assumption of compatibilism, and that's probably the biggest premise that most incompatibilists are going to deny. So we'll come back to that as well. Therefore, Bignon says, it follows, if God leaves human free choices undetermined, he permits or risks the existence of evil without any compensating goods, other than the fact that they're libertarianly free. Therefore, God does not leave human choices undetermined because that's a no-no, because God is maximally great. Therefore, Calvinist determinism is actually true, so that God does not want to risk evil. Right? He would rather not risk evil and then just say there's purposeless evil. He would rather determine the evil so he can say at least there's purpose in this evil. He's maximally great. Okay, here's what the argument doesn't give. The argument doesn't give an origin for evil. And this is why I try to supplement it with transworld deprivation. Because if transworld deprivation is true, at least we can say there's evil here, here's how it came about, and here's why God would rather have a world of determinism rather than indeterminism. Because even though he could not change the fact that if he were to create human creatures, they would just fall naturally, that's deprivation. Even though he couldn't change that fact, at least he can determine them to make a good purpose out of it anyways. That's so it really jives well, I think, with just jives well with Bignon's argument. But like I said, the premise is that more than likely they're going to defend against is number 2 and number 3. So I'll start with 3 because it's the easiest. It's just an assumption of compatibilism. There is no compensating good that comes from avoiding determinism. That's what it says. Bignon basically in the article leaves it untouched because he has written a whole book on compatibilism.
You hold it up again, it
And
was blurry.
he's written a whole
On,
book
it's
on
still frozen. Second. There we go.
He's written a whole book on compatibilism, excusing sinners blaming God. It's a rather cheeky title, but I think it's funny. In his chapter 6, he defends his arguments for compatibilism. Maybe another podcast episode we can get to that, but I'm going to leave it like that. And so if the or if the listener wants to listen or read that, then they can. But he basically leaves it in that article untouched. But if he shows in this book, if he shows compatibilism to be true, then I could easily tag on that argument that I just went through and just say, oh, also determinism is true as well.
Yeah.
Just to let you know. This is exactly, that's amazing. That's what we want, right? Compatibilism is still a big win, but that doesn't mean determinism follows. So I think if we tagged on Bignon's argument with his other arguments for compatibilism in that book, it's pretty great. It's like a 1-2 punch. It's awesome. Number 2, most non-Calvinists are going to deny that. It says this again. If God leaves human choices undetermined, the world contains, or at least had been risked to contain, at least some evil whose sole rationale is to avoid determinism. In other words, God doesn't want to determine the world because that would eliminate human free creatures. Human free creatures having libertarian free will is a great good, so therefore he has to create a world in which libertarian free creatures reign. Here's the problem. In order to do that, the world has to be risked to contain evil because obviously human free creatures could do evil. That's literally the Molinist argument for the free will defense. So really, I don't know why anyone would reject this premise because to me it's just the free will defense. That God cannot create a world of human libertarianly free creatures and have there also at the same time no evil to obtain. If God creates a world of libertarian free creatures, there will be evil because they are libertarianly free. And so in order to avoid determinism, which according to the non-Calvinists would eradicate responsibility, you have to have a world of libertarian free creatures. But if you do, evil will come about. So that's exactly what Bignon is saying. If God leaves human free choices undetermined, the world will contain at least some evil whose sole rationale is just to avoid determinism. And that lends it to no compensating good, if compatibilism is true. And if it lends it to no compensating good, why would God want, as a maximally great being, a world of purposeless evil? This is most clearly seen in open theism, quite obviously, because God is experiencing the evil right there, right next to you, right?
Yeah.
For the first time. But for simple foreknowledge and also Molinists, this is pretty powerful. They want to obviously deny it, and it's a little harder to get the Molinists on train with this, but it's still true. Because it's not rooted in that there is just randomly purposeless evil. The purposeless evil that Bignon is talking about is rooted in the fact of libertarian free creatures, which is exactly what all the other systems want to claim. If it's rooted in that fact, if you hold a libertarian free will, you will have purposeless evil in some way, shape, or form. And if you will have purposeless evil, what Bignon says is it's more than likely God doesn't want that. He doesn't want to risk creation with purposeless evil. And because he doesn't do that, he determines it instead. Therefore, determinism is true. I think it's a pretty
So
good argument.
it's a great argument. I was even thinking probably the bigger point contention would have to be God only ever permits mercy's sense of evil, sufficient saying good. If you swallow that pill, then you're done. Like
Yeah.
you would have to say that God does permit evil without sufficient. And that's
Mhm.
always been my biggest drawback with other forms of theological thought is I can't accept that. I can't accept a
Mhm.
God that allows evil for the sake of maintaining freedom. It
Yeah.
doesn't it obviously in the grand scheme of the universe, freedom and evil, I mean evil's way worse than our freedom. I think if our government could like just press a button and force everybody to do good or not break the laws, they wouldn't.
Mhm.
So I don't know. It's just that was a bad example.
I get what you're saying. And some libertarians have said, oh, well, free will is not an intrinsic good,
Yeah.
it's just an instrumental good. And so God sees it as an instrumental good, and so should we. But the argument still goes through, even if it's an instrumental good. Even though, like, the Molinists can still say that God doesn't want to create a world of free creatures or of non-free creatures because then they would lose moral responsibility. So he creates a world of free creatures so that they gain moral responsibility. So you still have that instrumental part there. But if even with that, you still have a world of free creatures doing evil, and that's still why God actualized that world in order to preserve not just their free will, but their instrumental part, the moral responsibility. You still get the argument even if you make that distinction.
Just one of those things where I hear something like that and I'm just like, I don't have any way around it. I don't.
Uh,
Sorry, like I'm not smart enough to weasel my way or delusional enough to see what
Beyond
the
is
argument's
brilliant.
saying.
He's just a brilliant philosopher. Um, and I've had the pleasure to talk to him at least once. So I'm, I don't
What'd
want
you
to
say
belabor
to
the
him?
point.
What'd you say?
I asked him if, so back to blockage Frankfurt style cases. Actually, this is actually really, because this is going to be the next thing that we're going to talk about.
Hey, hey.
But deficient, efficient permission, like how can the Calvinist determinists still hold to permission language if God determines all things? We say deficient causation. And his analogy that I've explained previously, I think in episode 2, of a bobsled, that the sinner needs no guiding in order to sin. They will sin naturally on their own, just like a bobsled will go down naturally on their own. I asked him if that is similar to a blockage Frankfurt style case because I know he rejects Frankfurt style cases as arguments for compatibilism. Like I do. He said that technically he didn't think about it like that before, but he wouldn't necessarily say that's not. So, in other words, you could use his model that we utilize with the deficient efficient causation or divine permission language. You could say that is a blockage Frankfurt style case and still be fine. I'm like, great, because I already do that. So
Okay. There you go.
that's an argument for determinism. The last is just easy, kind of wrapping it up, and that's just okay. Is there an actual model for determinism? We have an argument for determinism. Do we have a model for it? I think we do. So some models for providence is something like the domino theory for determinism, that if you push a domino, the next domino goes, the next domino goes, the next domino goes, and then, you get the end result. So the pushing of the first domino determines the last domino. That is sometimes utilized by some scholars, non-Calvinists and Calvinists alike, to model the providence of determinism, and I don't like that model at all. Because what it does is it's just one dimensional. It doesn't quite get at the fact of God determining it. It's more of like a direct determiner, and
Like
it
a
doesn't
first
really,
cause
yeah, it doesn't
causes
really
all
get
other.
it doesn't get at the fact that we are a source, we are a second cause, and we have agency. So I don't really like that model. It's too horizontal.
Yeah.
The other model is an authorial model, which definitely is not without its objectors, but I think it does a lot better. An authorial model is something like this: Shakespeare is not morally responsible for Hamlet or for Macbeth killing everyone that he kills in his play Macbeth.
Yeah.
But Shakespeare is the determiner, as he is the author of Macbeth killing what he kills. And so we can have God, instead of being like a computer simulator where we're in a computer simulation, we're in a novel, we're in God's novel, and he has determined a great story for us, and a story full of redemption and grace and peace and so forth. I think that model is a little bit better.
You just stopped talking, or you cut
Yeah,
out something.
I'm done.
Oh, okay. So am I supposed to do the last one? I'm not
I
good at
mean,
this.
so that's just the authorial model. I can do the last one if you want. The
No.
last one is just
Nope.
the
Nope. Nope. Nope.
deficient
Nope. Nope.
deficient
Nope. Shut
determination.
up. All right, now that you introduced it, ask me.
Shamez, since you're so good at explaining it, what is it? Tell it to me like I'm 5.
Okay, not gonna do that. I'll pretend you're rational, thinking person who's capable of understanding simple. I don't think 5-year-old. So, um, the way I've explained this before, actually using here, this couch right behind me. When he was younger, he would love to just run and jump off this couch and just biff it, like face plant into the ground, hurt himself, get all upset, and he'd cry, yada yada. And then like 10 minutes later, he'd do the exact same thing. Whatever reason, it was in his nature to jump off this couch and hurt himself. He thought it was hilarious. I don't understand why. Um, so go usually. I don't remember. Obviously that's an example of what we are as humans. We, I would say, by default, have an
Off
affinity
couches.
to jump off the couch, to sin, to do things that are normally like not good for
Mm.
us. That's like us in neutral. So I, as a good father, I would see him do this, and I wouldn't necessarily stop him from doing it all the time. So like I could tell him like don't jump off the couch, but I knew for a matter of fact, no matter what I said, because he's capable of understanding me, if I left the
Mm.
room, even if I was sitting right there, he would still jump off the couch. The only way I could make him not jump off the couch is physically go over there and restrain him from jumping off. That's it. That's the only way it would stop. So sometimes I would do that. I really didn't want to deal with it. Sometimes I'd see him about to jump and I'd run over and catch him to like keep him from
Mm.
hurting himself. And then other times, he needs to learn his lesson. I would just let him jump on the couch and hurt himself because he needs to learn that that's what he's doing.
Mm.
I'm trying to remember how this goes because I haven't explained. Wow. Excuse me. Now you're never going to let me explain it. Losing my privileges. I just need to stop remembering it and just retell it. That's what I need to do. If I'm really good, I'll cut all this, make it seem like it's a coherent thought, but for the sake of being transparent, I probably won't. So I think when we talk about efficient with God, that mechanism looks exactly like that.
Mm.
Efficiently, I'm just saying I'm not doing anything. I have no influence on the situation. So what does my kid do? He jumps off the couch and hurts himself because I'm doing. And
Mm.
if I'm going to be efficient, it would be me going over there and catching him as he jumps off the couch so he wouldn't get hurt, or physically restraining him so that he couldn't jump off. I could have an ottoman over this way. I could move the ottoman in front of the couch, and then he would have no way of jumping off the couch and hurting himself. There's a lot of different things I could do to make it impossible for him to jump off the couch. I could get him out of this room.
Mm.
So whatever the reason, but that would be me efficiently causing something to happen. And I think that those are the two mechanisms that we talk about in relation to how does a deterministic God allow somebody to sin. I would say because he is not doing anything to influence the situation or change their minds. Like when David saw Bathsheba, bathing on the rooftop, the reason that David slept with Bathsheba is because God determined it to happen, right? And at first
Mm.
glance, you're like, oh my goodness, that's awful. How is that possible? Like, well, God deficiently allowed it to happen. He deficiently caused it by not doing anything.
Mm.
That's how it was caused, by a lack of God acting. And if you think about sin and evil in general, what is it? It is a lack of any influence from God. It's evil is the absence of light. And that's how
Mm.
these two things work together. So I would say, like with the example of my kids, um, obviously they're my children. So in this circumstance, it'd be God and a believer. I would say that God would never allow, you know, me to do something, or I would never allow my kid to jump off the couch and seriously hurt themselves to the point where they would die. I knew for a
Mm.
fact if he does it one more time, he's done for. He's gonna snap his neck. I would not let him do it. I would efficiently cause that to never happen. And I would say that that's kind of, you can use that example for maybe perseverance of the saints or being saved at some point, whatever the case.
Mm.
But I might allow it to happen so that he learns over time from getting hurt that he can trust me. If he listens to what I have to say, eventually he's not doing it because I keep restraining him and physically can't. He'll be doing it because he learns to trust his father and to take him at his own word. So eventually I think that if you're a believer, that's kind of how that mechanism works, is that over time God may let you jump off the couch and mess up and sin, but eventually you'll realize it's hurting you and you'll start to listen to the word, listen to God, and then you could get to the point where your nature starts to change, where it's not in your nature jump off the couch. It's not something you even want to do or even consider it. And I think that, that's just you becoming more Christ-like in the process of transformation and letting the Holy
Mm.
Spirit work in you, all that good stuff. So eventually, even if God is efficiently acting, you're not going to be making those same mistakes. He doesn't have to constantly efficiently get in your way of sinning. It's just not something you. And it's kind of taking it a step further, but I think overall that's kind of how I think the Christian life works, and I think that process is what the scripture is talking about by how believers glorify God, is that
Mm.
we decide within our own nature and our own agency, something changes to where we don't want to sin anymore. And I think that that's edifying. It's making it so that even without efficient causation, you'll still make the right decisions. And when we get our glorified bodies, I think that that'll be the case all the time, with
Yeah.
all aspects of life. We're not there yet. I don't know if I did a good job. It makes
No, I
sense
think
to
that was a
me.
good job. I think other examples, like I said, is the bobsled example. That it's this counterfactual pair that if you were to pull the brakes on the bobsled, you can efficiently direct where it would go. But
Yeah.
if you just let it do its own thing, it will naturally just fall.
Yeah.
Another thing is, if you ever watched the movie Minority Report, it's kind of old, like 15 some years old, with Tom Cruise, Colin Farrell in it. There's a scene where he has a ball and then he rolls the ball on the table, and Colin Farrell, the character, actually catches it as it fell off the table. Then Tom Cruise is like, "Why'd you catch it?" Then Colin's like, "Because it was gonna fall." And he's like, "Well, how do you know it was gonna fall? Like, you didn't see it happening." It's like, "I knew it was gonna fall because that's the disposition of the ball. When it's on a table and then it goes off the edge, it falls. So I caught it." So this idea is similar that the ball needs no more engagement from an agent in order to fall. It will fall naturally. The bobsled would fall naturally. Right? Another example would be something like this. You see a burglar on a ladder, and Bignon uses this example too. You see a burglar on a ladder about to, break into an apartment up there. If you did nothing, the burglar will burglar,
Burglar.
burger, burglarize, yeah, steal or whatever. But if you kick the ladder underneath him, he would fall, right? So if you kick the ladder underneath, he would fall, and then so the idea of this idea of disposition is very common. I'm actually currently trying to work on a theory of compatibilist freedom where it's similar to that.
Yeah.
This idea of disposition is what causes us to do what we do.
It's
Actually,
just in nature.
I'll show you another book. Great book. This is my most expensive book I've ever bought. This
Pot.
book right here. Bought, yeah, whatever. It says causes, laws, and free will. Why determinism does not matter. Brilliant. So she is Kadri Vivellen, is a compatibilist, and she tries to argue for something like dispositions. So she calls dispositional compatibilism. And it's similar to the conditional compatibilism that we talked about before, but this is disposition that the agent has a certain disposition and that lends them to do what they do. Me, that's straight up what something very similar to what deprivation is trying to say.
Yeah.
And so this this cost me $91.
Holy cow! Why is this so expensive? The
I
translation?
know I have no idea. It's new. It's like 2013, but it's from Oxford, and books are really
Oh,
expensive.
they might
So
have a monopoly on that book
yeah.
or whatever. I get that.
So good book. I only read like the intro, and I'm so excited to dig into it more.
Well, maybe
But
we'll have to go about as you. But I just would say, like, even if you want to, like, the reason we started the podcast talking about trans world deprivation, that's pretty much our argument as to why our deposition, I would say, is a sin nature. Like, that's just naturally where we're at. Why are we naturally there? World trans world deprivation. We're not God. Because we're not God, we are going to have to struggle um, through certain things and kind of naturally the way things digress to get to the point where we're alive right now doing the things that we're doing and the situations we're in
yeah,
is all a natural consequence of our own nature. Now I've heard some arguments of people like, well, that still goes back to God because he's the one who's giving us that sin nature. He's the reason we're like that. And I'm like, no, the reason we're like that is because we're not God and he allowed us to make our own decisions and we chose in our own agency that we were going to be sinful. And I
mm,
believe that, there's an alternate possibility where maybe Adam and Eve never sinned and they're always in the garden and we just continue life hunky dory living in the garden with no issues at all. And perfect communion with God. That might have been a possibility, but because we're not God, because we are human, that's just not what we chose. That's not what Adam and Eve chose. That's not what I would have chose. That's not what you would have chose. There's something, maybe that's part of our nature too. There's something irresistible about the knowledge between good and
Mm-hmm.
evil. The desire to be like God. And even, when Eve had her first child, she's like, look, I created a creature just like God created a creature. I'm a godlike being. See, I can create life too. It's just something in our nature that we just want to pat ourselves on the back and think we're like God in some ways. So why that's the case, we can argue about. I think we have a good answer. But we know for a fact that is the case right now, that we have sin nature. Where does that lead us? It leads us to always making the wrong decisions, or maybe just not the best decisions. They could be good. Like you can be a non-believer and never have any influence from God and still live a decent life. I believe that, but it's still going to be, full of failures, full of shortcomings. Missing the mark is, what sin is, and your lives can be full of that. And even if you are a Christian, it's going to be full of that. But I think that part of being a Christian is that maybe sometimes throughout your life you can actually hit the mark at some points with something, some small ways. And that's only going to happen if God efficiently causes it to. Changes your name. Holy Spirit works. Irresistible grace, becoming saved, all of that good stuff is part of that. And I would say that the story of the Bible, see where God is deficiently letting humans do what they want. Was it the Tower of Babel first, or no, that was after the flood. So God's not doing anything, and then we get to the point of the flood where he steps in and efficiently causes the flood to happen. And I would say, like, maybe God also efficiently caused Noah to be a believer and to be righteous and to trust him, or that was just for whatever reason within Noah's nature that he was like that and he wanted to please God, and God rewarded him for his obedience. However you go on the scale, it doesn't really matter. We know he built the ark, and the rest of everyone else was destroyed, his family.
Yeah.
And then deficiently again, you get the Tower of Babel. They're building the tower. They want to be like God. They want to reach up to the heavens. God efficiently comes in and scatters them with different, spread out all over.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just back and forth, letting people do what they want, God stepping in and making things happen. It's one or the other. I would say it's pretty clear throughout the scriptures which is which. Like Peter, denying Jesus 3 times. God was deficiently allowing that to happen, letting him make no mistakes. And then you get, a few weeks later, after he gets rose up and Peter steps forward to be a leader in the church, you get to the Pentecost. What happens? He's efficiently filled with the Holy Spirit, gives a great sermon. 1,000 people get saved that day. And that's because God stepped in and filled him with the Holy Spirit and equipped him to be able to do what he was. Same with Paul, same with a lot of the different disciples. Go through the New Testament, you'll see this back and forth the whole time. So to me, like when you explain that to me, I've never heard of it. Right when I heard it the first time, I was like, yeah, that's what it is. It's just back and forth. Entire way through. Even my own life, I feel that back and forth, like small ways and sometimes in significant ways. Times where I felt like God stepped in and I was doing really well. I was being obedient. And then times where there's just not much going on spiritually. I would say that I'm causing that by not listening, by not being obedient or caring in the first place. Maybe it's just a matter of God deficiently allowing me to go off and do my own thing and make my own mistakes. And then, what do you know? Eventually it catches up with me. Things go horrible. I reach out for forgiveness or some type of wisdom to get me out of the situation or to learn from my situation. And then I'm becoming a better Christian.
Yeah.
That's a process I can get behind 100%. So at first, like, when Coleman was explaining all this stuff to me, I was like constantly saying, like, why does it matter? Like, why do I care? Why should I care? Like, I didn't care about any of this stuff. Never read about it. Never really argued about it. I was just aware of the conversation. Didn't really care to get too involved. But I think that, at least for me, this part of this conversation has real life application, I think, and kind of perfectly explains somebody maybe who's had a lot of struggles in life how would God allow for these terrible things to happen. Like, what is the reason? Like do we have answers for this stuff? And there's a plan for you, and there's, you know, ways that he will step in, will help, and you will see change. All of that's going to happen, and I can tell you that with full confidence. So I don't know, it helps me kind of, you know, be a better disciple and reach out to people. I have a way to frame this conversation that makes sense to me and really believe, and I explain with relative.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've talked way too much, so that was all we had right now. Do you have any last closing statements, arguments,
Oh,
hopes, dreams?
I think I don't. Honestly, probably the next episode will be together.
Yeah,
That's my guess. And then the next episode after that will be probably sometime in January.
yeah.
Not sure what it would be on. We kind of finished this models of providence. Maybe some other fun things like I don't know. I have no
God
idea.
will efficiently show us the way, and
Yeah.
if God efficiently allows us to be idiots, then it's just going to be a terrible episode.
Maybe some other forms
And
of theology. Maybe like I don't know. Um, no idea.
well,
Maybe
I think
eschatology.
whatever we decide to do in person will maybe launch us into our topic for the next conversation. Um, but whatever, like, we're gonna have this one out. What is it? Today's the 11th, so we meet on like the end of the month, like 28th, 29th.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll have this episode, then 2 more weeks, then we'll have the next episode out. And that next one, I still don't really know what we're gonna do, but it's gonna be very different. We're gonna be together in person. We're gonna have one camera, one mic, and we probably won't really be having any deep theological conversations. Maybe we will. I don't know. It might just be fun and silly and just us hanging out and having a good time. But we'll record something and put it out. And I apologize in advance because it's probably gonna be garbage. So feel free to skip it. Or it might be really cool. I'll let you know beforehand. Um, once I'll put a disclaimer in the beginning of the video, like, hey, this is actually some good stuff, and if you really want to listen to it, skip to like 30 minutes in, we start having a conversation about yada yada yada. Or it'll just be goofy. We'll see. Should be fun. And with that, I guess we're done, right?
Man.
I'm good. As always, dislike the video if you made it this far. So far no one has. So I know no one's listening to our whole. That's fine. It'll be here forever. Maybe if it goes 30 years, someone gets out the old YouTube archives and digs us up, and, you know, maybe something happens then. I don't know. Let's see.
Maybe.
Or it's all just a big waste of time. Who knows? I don't really care either way. I'm enjoying it. So, anyways, if you guys enjoy it too, dislike the video. I'll see ya. Peace.